The moment my father's ring finally cracked, I was 300 yards from a jackknifed fuel truck, snow slashing sideways into my face, screaming into a radio for a medevac bird that couldn't fly in this wind. I didn't know yet that my name was about to hit every television screen in the country. I didn't know that the man having Christmas dinner without me was about to see my face on the 6E News and drop a wine glass on his kitchen floor. All I knew in that instant was that a stranger's life was slipping through my hands, and I was the only one who could stop it. 3 days before Christmas, my father called me at 1900 hours right, as I was locking up my office for the night. "Don't come this year," he said. "No hello, no warm-up, just that." I stood there holding the phone, my coat half on, and for a second I thought I'd misheard him. "Jason's going to be here," he continued like that, explained everything. "Okay," I said slowly. "That's fine, Dad. I haven't seen Jason in a while. I don't want you making things awkward for him." I felt something in my chest go very still the way it does right before a convoy hits an IED, that half second of silence before the world tells you it's about to hurt. Awkward, how I asked, though some tired, resigned part of me already knew. He sighed the kind of sigh that meant he'd rehearsed this. Jason had just gotten married. His new in-laws were coming. Half the neighborhood was coming. My father didn't want anyone bringing up the army. Didn't want anyone asking me questions that might make Jason feel, in his words, overshadowed. He's finally settling down. Erica, building something. I don't want the attention pulled somewhere else. Not this year. I've stood in rooms with generals. I've briefed colonels twice my age without my voice shaking. But something about my father's voice on the other end of that call made me 18 years old again. Standing in the driveway with a duffel bag, watching him shake Jason's hand at a graduation that wasn't even Jason's. "I understand," I said. That was it. No arguing, no asking him to reconsider. 18 years in this uniform teaches you which battles are worth fighting and which ones you walk away from with your dignity still intact. This was the second kind. I hung up, sat on the edge of my bed for a long moment, and then did what I always do. I opened my laptop and canceled the flight. My team found out 2 days later when Sergeant Alvarez asked what time my plane left on the 23rd. I told her plans had changed. She didn't push good soldiers no when a subject is closed. But she did corner me at the motor pool an hour after that and tell me I was welcome at her sister's place for dinner. No argument accepted. I've got the duty roster to think about. I told her which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that half my unit had kids waiting for them at home. Spouses who'd spent a year alone, while their soldiers were downrange parents, counting the days until they could hug their children again. I didn't have anywhere urgent to be. So, I volunteered to take the overnight shift on the 24th, freed up 2 junior soldiers to go be with their families, and told myself it didn't sting nearly as much as it did. Colorado in December doesn't ease you into winter. It hits you like a closed fist. By the afternoon of the 24th, the forecast had shifted from light snow to state of emergency in the span of about 6 hours, and by 1800, my unit had been activated to support state and county responders working the interstate corridor. Visibility was dropping to almost nothing. Cars were sliding off the shoulder faster than tow trucks could reach them. I remember standing in the equipment bay, pulling on my cold weather gear, listening to the wind already howling against the hangar doors, and feeling something settle in me that I can only describe as clarity. This I understood. This had rules, procedures, a chain of command, a purpose. Family apparently did not. I thought about my father's dining room table as I climbed into the truck. The good china would be out. The tablecloth my mother used to use before she passed, now repurposed for a family gathering I wasn't part of. Jason would be telling a story about his promotion, and my father would be laughing in that warm, easy way he never quite managed with me anymore. I let myself feel that for exactly as long as it took to zip up my jacket. Then I put it away. The way you learn to put everything away when the mission requires your full attention and your personal life has to wait its turn. My radio crackled. Command wanted units staged along the interstate. Within the hour, reports of multiple vehicles down a passenger bus. Among them, visibility near zero. I climbed into the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, snow already collecting on my sleeves, my breath fogging in front of my face. Behind me, in a warm house 40 minutes away, my father was raising a glass to a toast I wasn't there to hear. Ahead of me, the storm was waiting, and so, though none of us knew it yet, was every camera crew in the state. I checked my gear one last time, nodded to my driver, and we pulled out into the white. The storm didn't just arrive that night. It announced itself the way real disasters always do, with a violence that made the forecasters look almost cautious. By the time we reached mile marker 214, visibility was down to maybe 30 feet, and the wind was strong enough to rock the truck on its suspension. Cairns radio traffic had gone from routine to urgent in a matter of minutes. A charter bus, nearly 40 passengers, had slid off the northbound shoulder and rolled onto its side. A pickup truck behind it had jackknifed trying to avoid the wreck. There were reports of children on board the bus. There were reports, worse, of a fuel tanker stopped just uphill from the wreck, its driver unaccounted for. We were the first unit on scene. I don't remember making a conscious decision to take charge. It happened the way it always happens. Muscle memory built over 18 years, overriding whatever fear might otherwise have taken hold. I was out of the truck before it had fully stopped, boots sinking into 8 in of fresh snow, shouting instructions over the wind. I split my small team into triage groups. I got Alvarez coordinating with the state troopers already scrambling to secure the scene. I got on the radio and started fighting for a medevac helicopter, even though every dispatcher I spoke to told me flight conditions were borderline impossible. Then we work until they're possible, I said, and moved on to the next problem. The bus was the priority. Passengers were trapped at odd angles, a few with visible injuries, most just shaken and terrified, screaming for their kids in 3 different languages through the shattered windows. I climbed up onto the exposed side of the vehicle myself, snow stinging my face like static, and helped pass children down through the emergency exit one by one, into waiting arms below. A boy maybe 6 years old wouldn't let go of my jacket sleeve, even after I'd handed him down to a trooper. I remember crouching to his eye level, for exactly 3 seconds all the time I had, and telling him he was safe, now that he'd done such a good job staying calm. Then I was back up pulling the next passenger free. It was the fuel truck that nearly took everything sideways. The driver, an older man named Walt, was still inside his cab, disoriented, one leg pinned by a section of buckled dashboard. The tanker had begun to lean on the icy shoulder, and any spark, any impact, any shift in the wrong direction could have turned the whole scene into something none of us walked away from. My team lead recommended we wait for the hazmat unit. Protocol would have agreed with him. I didn't wait. I got a trooper to help me brace the cab door, told Alvarez to keep everyone else back 100 meters, and climbed up myself. Walt was in shock, breathing shallow blood on his forehead from where he'd hit the wheel. I talked to him the entire time I worked his leg free. Asked him about his grandkids. Learned he had 4. Learned the youngest had just started walking, anything to keep him present, keep him calm, keep his breathing steady while the wind screamed around us. And I felt the ice under my boots shifting with every gust. When his leg came loose, I pulled him out over my shoulder, half carried, half dragged him 30 yards through snow that came up past my knees until we were both clear of the tanker, and I could finally let myself feel my hands shaking. I didn't know in that moment that a local news van had been parked at the edge of the scene since the bus rollover, its reporter and cameraman filming everything from a safe distance. The bus rescue, the fuel truck extraction, all of it in the harsh white glare of emergency lighting. I didn't think about cameras. I didn't think about anything except the next task, and the one after that, and the one after that. The way you do when the job in front of you is the only thing keeping you upright. By the time the medevac helicopter finally broke through a gap in the storm, 2 hours later, we had stabilized every passenger from the bus, treated Walt for a fractured leg and mild hypothermia, and cleared the scene enough for tow trucks to begin the long process of hauling vehicles off the ice. I sat in the back of our truck afterward, peeling off gloves stiff with frozen sweat, and let myself exhale for the first time in what felt like hours 40 feet away at my father's table. The evening had moved into dessert. I know this because Jason told me himself months later how he'd been holding court about his promotion, his new house, his plans for the spring, while my father beamed at him the way fathers are supposed to beam at their children. Nobody at that table said my name once. Nobody wondered where I was or what I might be doing on a night when half the state was under a storm warning. I wasn't a subject worth raising. I wasn't in that room a daughter at all. Just an absence nobody had bothered to notice. I didn't know that yet, riding back to base with frost still clinging to my eyelashes. I only knew that we'd gotten everyone out alive, that Walt would see his grandkids again, that the little boy on the bus was already asleep in his mother's arms by the time I climbed down from the wreck. I thought that would be the end of it. Just another night, another mission, another quiet act nobody outside my unit would ever hear about. I had no idea the cameras had caught my face. I found out the way most people find out things about themselves anymore, secondhand, and far too late to have any say in it. We'd made it back to base a little after 2300, exhausted, soaked through despite the cold weather gear running on adrenaline that was already starting to crash. I filed my after-action notes, checked on Walt's transport to the hospital, made sure every soldier under my command had eaten something and gotten dry clothes, and then finally sat down in the break room with a lukewarm cup of coffee I didn't really want. Someone had the television on in the corner, tuned to a local station. The volume low, I wasn't even looking at it. Then Alvarez said my name in a strange voice and I looked up. There I was on the screen, climbing the side of an overturned bus snow, whipping sideways across the frame, handing a child down into a trooper's arms. The cron beneath the footage read, "Breaking soldier leads. Dramatic highway rescue during record blizzard." A local reporter's voice narrated over the clip, describing what she called one of the most extraordinary rescue efforts this region has seen in years. And then the footage cut to the fuel tanker to me, pulling Walt free, just before the truck's undercarriage buckled further, under its own shifting weight. I sat there holding my coffee, feeling strangely detached from the person on the screen, like I was watching someone else's night unfold. Within 20 minutes, my phone started buzzing first, slowly, then constantly. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, an old high school friend, my commanding officer who simply texted, "Handle the press calls. However you want, Major, you earned that." I didn't know it yet. But 40 feet away, my father's dinner had reached the coffee and pie stage when Jason, scrolling his phone at the table, went very quiet. He told me the rest of it later in pieces, because for a long time neither of us wanted to relive it in full. He said he saw the headline first. A soldier's name he didn't recognize, attached to a rescue video autoplay in his feed, and scrolled past it without much thought. Then someone at the table turned on the television for the 10:00 broadcast more out of holiday habit than anything else. And the same footage came up this time on the national feed, because by then 2 of the big networks had picked up the story. Jason said he sat up straight before he even understood why. Something about the walk, the voice giving orders through the wind, was too familiar to ignore. Then the camera caught my face clearly snow-crusted along my collar, and he said her name out loud without meaning to. "Erica." The table went quiet. My father, according to Jason, actually laughed at first, a short disbelieving sound, the kind you make when your brain hasn't caught up to what your eyes are telling you. Then the anchor said it plainly, reading straight off a teleprompter. "Major Erica Sullivan, an active-duty Army officer, is being credited with saving dozens of lives during last night's highway disaster." My father, Jason said, went pale in a way he'd never seen before. He stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped, and the wine glass in his hand slipped from his fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor. Nobody moved to clean it up. Every face at that table was turned toward the television, watching footage of a woman none of them had thought to invite. He called me 11 minutes later. I almost didn't answer. I was in the middle of coordinating a statement with our public affairs office, trying to figure out how much I was obligated to say to reporters who'd started calling the base directly. But something made me pick up. Sweetheart, his voice cracked on the single word. Why? Why are you on the national news? I could hear the television still going in the background of the call. Hear voices. I didn't recognize talking about me like I was a headline instead of a person. I thought about a dozen things I could have said. I thought about reminding him that 3 days ago, he'd told me not to come home. I thought about asking whether he'd have found out I existed at all, if a camera crew hadn't happened to be parked on that stretch of interstate. I didn't say any of it. I was doing my job, Dad. I told him, keeping my voice level, the same voice I use for briefings, for casualties, for anything that requires me not to fall apart in front of an audience. I have to go. There's still work to finish here. I hung up before he could respond, not out of cruelty. I want to be clear about that even now. I hung up because I genuinely did have work to finish, soldiers, to check on a chain of command waiting on my report. But if I'm honest with myself, some small, tired part of me also wanted him to sit with that silence a little longer. Wanted him to feel just once what it was like to reach for me and find the line already gone quiet. Outside, the storm had finally started to break, the wind easing into something almost gentle. I stood by the window for a moment, watching the last of the snow drift down under the security lights, and thought about how strange it was that the whole country now knew my name, before my own father had thought to ask where I'd be spending Christmas. Behind me, my phone kept buzzing on the table. I let it. The story didn't fade the way I expected it to. I'd assumed, the way you do with most local news, that it would run for a day or two and then get replaced by whatever came next. A different disaster, a different headline, the endless churn of the news cycle, moving on to someone else's worst or best night. Instead, it grew. By the 26th, the footage had been picked up by 3 national networks. By the 27th, a wire service had run a longer piece, complete with interviews from passengers off that bus, people who wanted to put a name and a face to the officer who'd pulled them out of the wreckage. I turned down almost every interview request. Public Affairs handled most of it on my behalf, issuing a short statement crediting the whole team, the state troopers, the tow crews, the dispatchers who'd fought to get a helicopter through impossible conditions. I meant every word of it. None of what happened that night was a solo effort. And it felt wrong, genuinely wrong. Not just modest to let the story become about one person when a dozen people had worked through the same storm to get everyone out alive. But some things I couldn't turn away from. A woman named Deb Marchetti, whose 8-year-old daughter had been the little girl on the bus, tracked down the base's public information officer and asked gently if her daughter could send me something. A few days later, a hand-drawn card arrived at the unit mailroom, crayon on construction paper, a stick figure in a uniform standing next to a bus. "Thank you, Major Sullivan," written across the top in a careful, wobbly hand. I kept that card in my desk drawer. I still have it. Walt's family drove out to the base itself. All 4 grandkids in tow, the youngest, just barely walking like Walt had told me that night. His daughter cried when she shook my hand. Walt himself, legs still in a brace, mostly just gripped my forearm and said, "You didn't have to climb up there." To which I told him the honest truth that I hadn't thought about it as a choice at all. Some decisions don't feel like decisions in the moment. They just feel like the next necessary thing. Through all of it, my father kept calling. The first day, I let it go to voicemail. The second day, I read his texts without responding. "Can we talk? I'm so proud of you. I didn't know. I should have known." Each message landed somewhere in my chest. I didn't particularly want to examine right then. I wasn't avoiding him out of spite. I was avoiding him because I genuinely didn't know what I would say. And 18 years in the Army has taught me not to open my mouth in a briefing until I actually have something worth saying. Jason texted too, which surprised me more than my father calling did. His message was shorter, and something about its plainness stuck with me longer than anything my father wrote. "I didn't know it was like this for you. I'm sorry. I mean that." I didn't respond right away. Not because I wanted to punish him. Jason had never been cruel to me. Not really. He'd simply spent years accepting the space he was given, without asking many questions about why it existed, or what it cost the person standing outside of it. There's a particular kind of quiet complicity in that the kind that doesn't require malice to still leave scars. I think some part of him understood that, now watching the same footage everyone else had watched, seeing for the first time what just the army had actually meant for the sister he'd shared a childhood with, and somewhere along the way stopped really knowing. I finished out that week the way I finished most weeks, checking on my soldiers, writing recommendations for 2 of them who deserved recognition for their work that night, following up on Walt's recovery, making sure the little girl's thank you card got a proper reply signed by the whole unit, not just me. Work has always been the thing that steadies me. When the rest of my life felt unresolved, undecided, sitting in some uncomfortable middle place I hadn't chosen, the job was still there, still clear, still exactly what it had always been. My father called a final time that Friday evening, and this time I picked up mostly because I was tired of watching my phone light up and doing nothing about it. "I don't expect you to fix this in one phone call," he said before I could say much of anything. His voice sounded different than it had on Christmas Eve. Smaller, less certain of itself. "I just want to see you in person whenever you're ready." I told him I'd think about it. That was true. I wasn't ready to hand him forgiveness, over the phone wrapped up neatly like it cost nothing, but I also wasn't the same person who'd quietly accepted, "Don't come this year," without so much as raising my voice. Something in me had shifted that night in the storm. Some old tired patience finally reaching its limit. I just didn't know yet how far my father was willing to go, to find out what he'd actually missed. He showed up at the base gate on a Tuesday morning, no warning, no phone call ahead of time, which was so unlike him that the young private on duty called it in as a courtesy before letting him through the visitor checkpoint. I came out to meet him in my duty uniform halfway through a shift and found him standing near the flagpole, looking smaller than I remembered, hands shoved in his coat pockets, eyes moving over the base like he was trying to memorize something he'd never bothered to look at before. I hadn't invited him. I hadn't told him where I worked exactly, or what my days looked like, because in 18 years he had never once asked. "I wanted to see it," he said before I could ask why he'd come, "where you actually work, what it looks like." I gave him a short tour, mostly out of some instinct I couldn't quite name, not forgiveness, not yet, but something closer to letting a door stay open a crack instead of closing it entirely. We walked past the motor pool, the supply depot, the briefing room where I spend most of my mornings. Soldiers passed us in the hallway, and every single one of them straightened slightly and said some version of, "Good morning, Major," out of habit more than performance. I watched my father notice that, watched something shift in his face each time it happened, like he was recalculating something he'd taken for granted his whole life. We ended up in the break room, the same one where I'd first seen my own face on television 2 weeks earlier. Colonel Whitfield, my commanding officer, happened to be there getting coffee, and when he realized who my father was, he set his cup down and pulled up a chair without being asked. "You should know something about your daughter," he said in the plain, unhurried way career officers tend to talk. He told my father about the promotion I'd turned down 3 years earlier. A desk job in Washington, better pay, shorter hours, the kind of position most people would have taken without a second thought. I'd said no, because it would have meant leaving my unit mid-employment cycle, and I didn't believe in walking out on people halfway through something hard. He told him about the 2 times I delayed my own transition out of active duty to finish training replacements, extending my commitment when I didn't have to. He told him about the disaster relief rotations I'd volunteered for on my own time, including one Thanksgiving I'd spent distributing water in a flooded county instead of coming home. My father sat very still through all of it, hands wrapped around a coffee cup he never drank from. "I didn't know any of that," he said quietly once the colonel had excused himself, and it was just the 2 of us again. "You never asked," I said, "not crew, just true." He nodded slow, like the words had weight he hadn't expected, and then, almost as an afterthought, almost like he was embarrassed to bring it up at all, he mentioned my birthday gifts, how every year for the past decade, a card and something thoughtful had arrived at his house, and how he'd always assumed, because Jason usually intercepted the mail and mentioned at first, that the gifts had come from him. I went quiet for a moment, turning that over in my head. I hadn't realized he didn't know. I'd sent those packages every year without fail. A book he'd mentioned, wanting a bottle of the bourbon he liked. Once a framed photograph from a trip we'd taken together before my mother passed. And I'd never once put a note inside claiming credit, because that had never been the point. I'd simply wanted him to feel remembered. It never occurred to me that somewhere along the way, the credit had quietly shifted onto someone else, and that my father had spent 10 years being grateful to the wrong child. I looked at him and understood all at once that this wasn't really about the gifts. It was about how easily I could disappear inside my own family, even while actively, deliberately trying to stay present in it. Jason came by the base that same afternoon. Having heard from my father that he was visiting, he found me alone near the vehicle bay and didn't waste time with small talk. "I knew," he said, "about the gifts. I knew they were from you, and I let him think they were from me every year. I never corrected it." He looked for the first time since I'd known him as an adult, genuinely ashamed of himself. I don't have an excuse. I liked how it made him look at me. "I didn't think about what it cost you." I didn't say anything for a moment. Some old defensive part of me wanted to let him sit in that guilt a while longer, the way I'd sat in the silence after every holiday I wasn't invited to. But another part of me, the part that had spent the last 2 weeks watching my father actually try clumsily and late to understand who I was, didn't have much appetite left for punishment. "Thank you for telling me," I said instead. "That's more than I expected." My father found us there a few minutes later, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the three of us stood in the same place without anyone performing anything. He didn't apologize right then. I think some part of him understood that apology needed more than a hallway and an audience. But when he finally did break down quietly, unexpectedly, right there near the trucks, his shoulders shaking in a way I genuinely never witnessed from him before I found I didn't have the urge to walk away. I just stood there and let him. He asked me to dinner a month later, and this time the invitation came with none of the usual conditions. "Just us," he said over the phone. "No relatives, no neighbors. I'm not even inviting Jason unless you want him there." I told him it could just be the two of us. Some conversations don't get easier with more people in the room, and I suspected this one was going to be hard enough as it was. He cooked, which surprised me. My father has never once in my entire adult life cooked a full meal from scratch. When I arrived, the kitchen smelled like the roast chicken my mother used to make, and for a moment, standing in the doorway, I felt something catch in my throat that had nothing to do with the storm or the news cameras or any of it. It snorts. Was just the smell of a kitchen I hadn't really stood in years. We ate at the small table in the kitchen instead of the dining room where Christmas dinner had happened, which I think was deliberate. Neither of us mentioned it, but I noticed. He didn't wait long to say what he'd clearly been rehearsing. "I owe you an apology," he said, setting down his fork. "Not the kind where I explain myself until it stops sounding like an apology. Just I'm sorry. I was wrong. I waited. 18 years of debriefs have taught me the value of letting silence do some of the work." He told me about the years after he remarried, how he'd thrown himself into building a relationship with Jason. Partly because he genuinely liked him, and partly, he admitted, because it felt like something he could still get right. His first marriage to my mother had ended in loss he never fully processed. He said that somewhere in trying to build something whole, out of the pieces he had left, he'd stopped paying attention to the daughter, who didn't need convincing to love him back. "I told myself you were fine," he said, "strong, self-sufficient, that you didn't need the same things Jason did." He shook his head slowly. I think it was easier to believe that than to admit I was choosing not to look. I thought about correcting him, about explaining that strength isn't the same as not needing anyone, that sufficiency is often just what happens when a person stops expecting help and starts building the capacity to survive without it. But I didn't say that. I don't think he needed a lecture. I think he needed for once to sit in the discomfort of his own honesty, without me softening it for him. "The thing that hurt the most," I said instead, choosing my words the way I'd choose them in a briefing, deliberate and unhurried. Wasn't that you wanted Jason there and not me? Families make room for different people in different seasons. I could have understood that if that's all it was. He looked up at me, waiting. It was that you thought I'd make things awkward just by being there. Just by being your daughter. My voice stayed even, but something in my chest had gone tight, saying it out loud finally, after weeks of carrying it quietly. You didn't say Jason needed space. You said I'd cause a problem. There's a difference. He didn't try to argue with that. I think if he had, I might have gotten up and left right then, dinner or no dinner. Instead, he just nodded slow and pained and said, "You're right. I don't have a way to make that not true. I can only tell you I understand it now, and I didn't before." We sat with that for a while. The chicken went cold between us, and neither of us seemed to care. Eventually, he asked about the war, about the deployments, about things he'd never once asked me in 18 years of service. Not out of performance. I could tell, but because he genuinely wanted to know. Now, in the same way you finally read a book everyone's been telling you to read for a decade. I told him some of it, not all of it. Some things I've never told anyone outside my unit, and I wasn't ready to hand those over that night, either. Before I left, he walked me to my car, hands in his coat pockets against the cold, and said one more thing. I don't expect this fixes anything overnight. I know that's not how this works. No, I agreed. It's not, but I'd like the chance to keep trying if you'll let me. I looked at him for a long moment, my father standing in his driveway in the same cold he'd once told me not to bring myself home into, finally asking instead of assuming. Okay, I said. We can try. It wasn't forgiveness. Not fully, not yet. But it was the first honest conversation we'd had in longer than either of us wanted to admit. And driving back to base that night, I found myself thinking that maybe that was enough of a start. A year moves faster than you expect it to, especially when you spend most of it rebuilding something you thought was already lost. My father and I didn't fix everything in that one dinner. And I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this get told too neatly sometimes. Like, an apology is a light switch instead of a long, unglamorous process. There were awkward phone calls in the months that followed. There were moments where old habits crept back in him. Forgetting to ask about my work. Me forgetting to give him the chance to ask. But there were also Sunday calls that became a habit instead of an obligation. A visit for my promotion ceremony, where he sat in the front row and didn't once mention Jason's name. And slowly, carefully, the outline of an actual relationship where there had only been distance before. So when December came around again, I wasn't entirely surprised when my father showed up at the base gate a second time. What surprised me was that he came without calling ahead on Christmas Eve itself and waited outside the visitor checkpoint for nearly 40 minutes until my shift ended, standing in the cold in a coat that wasn't warm enough for Colorado in December. Exactly like a man learning a year too late what it might have felt like to be waited for. I didn't want you spending tonight wondering if I'd remember, he said when I finally walked out and found him there. He handed me a small box wrapped simply, no ribbon, nothing performative about it. Inside was an old photograph, the two of us, decades younger, standing in front of the recruiting office the day I signed my enlistment papers. I remembered that day. I remembered how nervous I'd been, and how at the time I hadn't been entirely sure he was proud of the choice I was making. Looking at the photo now, I could see it in his face even then, something he apparently hadn't known how to say out loud back then, and had spent a year learning how to. On the back in his handwriting, he'd written, "You have always been my pride. It just took me too many years to find the courage to say it." I stood there in the cold for a long moment, holding that photograph, and didn't trust myself to say much of anything. Jason arrived a few minutes later, having driven up separately, which told me my father had planned this more carefully than he was letting on. Jason didn't ask for forgiveness. He'd apparently learned over the past year that forgiveness isn't something you can request on a schedule that's convenient for you. He just thanked me quietly without performance, the way an honest apology usually sounds. "You never once made me feel guilty," he said, "even when you had every right to. I don't think I ever thanked you for that." I told him he didn't owe me a debt for simply not being cruel to him. but I understood what he meant, and I let the moment sit there between us, without rushing past it the way I've learned not to rush past the things that actually matter. We ended up, the three of us, at the Veterans Support Center downtown that night, carrying trays of food into a hall full of people who, for one reason or another, didn't have anywhere else to be on Christmas Eve. My father hadn't asked to come along. He'd simply shown up in old work clothes ready to carry boxes, and I found I didn't have it in me to turn him away. We spent the evening serving dinner, refilling coffee, sitting with veterans who told stories nobody else had asked here in a long time. My father listened to every one of them like it mattered, and I think watching him that something in me finally settled. Not because the past had been erased, but because the present had become something worth trusting. Late that night, walking back to the car through a light snow that felt nothing like the storm from a year before, I thought about how strange it was that the worst Christmas of my life had somehow led me here. A year ago, my father told me not to come home because he was afraid I'd make someone else feel small. Tonight, he stood in the cold on Christmas Eve, just to make sure I never felt forgotten again. I used to think the hardest missions were the ones with sirens and stretchers and lives hanging in the balance out on some icy highway. I don't think that anymore. I think the hardest mission any of us ever faces is finding our way back to the people we love, especially when they've made that path harder than it needed to be. That night in the storm, I thought I was just doing my job. It turns out I was also finding my way back to my own family. I just didn't know it yet. If this story moved you even a little, I'd love to hear where it found you tonight. Drop a comment below and let me know what part stayed with you the longest. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. So, if you don't want to miss what's coming next, go ahead and subscribe. I am Claire, 33 years old, and after my husband threw me out into the pouring rain without a single cent, I thought my life was completely over. When I tried to use an old card my father had left me, the bank manager turned pale, slung open his door, and shouted for everyone to move aside. I was in complete shock when I discovered that my late father had secretly left me an empire, and my ex-husband had unknowingly borrowed millions from a firm I now owned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. It was a Tuesday evening, and the rain in our suburban Connecticut neighborhood was coming down in relentless sheets. Cold water soaked straight through my coat, clinging to my skin, as I walked up the paved walkway of the house I had called home for 4 years. I was utterly exhausted. As a UX researcher for an educational technology company, I had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift analyzing user data, desperately trying to keep my head above water at work while my personal life crumbled. All I wanted was to step inside, take a hot shower, and crash onto the couch. I reached out my shivering hand and typed my usual 6-digit PIN into the sleek smart lock on the front door. The keypad chimed 3 times with a sharp, harsh red flash. Access denied. I frowned, thinking my fingers were just too wet. So, I wiped the glass screen with my sleeve and carefully punched in the numbers again. Access denied. The lock buzzed mechanically, rejecting me a second time. My heart did a sudden, uncomfortable flip in my chest. Before I could even pull my phone out to check if the electronic system was glitching, the heavy oak door swung open from the inside. Standing in the warm golden glow of the foyer was my 35-year-old husband, Harrison. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy sweater and slacks, holding a glass of scotch in his right hand. But he was not alone. Flanking him on his left, wearing an oversized silk robe that I recognized instantly because it belonged to me, was Kendall. At 28, Kendall was a commercial real estate broker, a woman Harrison had introduced to me 6 months ago as a prospective client for his venture capital firm. Harrison did not smile, nor did he look surprised to see me shivering under the dark sky. He simply took a slow sip of his drink and looked down at me as if I were a stray dog on his porch. I stood there, water dripping from my hair onto my face, my eyes darting from his cold face to Kendall, who was leaning casually against the doorframe with a smug, victorious smirk. "What is going on, Harrison?" I asked, my voice trembling from the freezing cold and a sudden wave of nausea. Why is my code not working? And why is Kendall wearing my robe? Harrison did not answer me right away. Instead, he casually pointed his glass toward the manicured front lawn. I turned my head following his gesture and felt my breath catch in my throat. Sitting right there in the muddy grass, completely exposed to the torrential downpour, were 3 large black garbage bags. One of them had ripped open at the seam, and I could see my clothes, my books, and the framed photograph of my late father soaking in the mud. Harrison stepped forward onto the covered porch, pulling a thick stack of papers from his back pocket. Without a word of explanation, he tossed the documents directly at my feet. The pages scattered across the wet concrete, instantly getting soaked. "Pack your things and get off my property," Harrison said, his voice flat, devoid of a single drop of emotion. "We are done, Claire. Those are your divorce papers." I stared at the papers on the ground, then looked up at him in sheer disbelief. "Are you insane?" I yelled over the sound of the falling rain. "You cannot just throw me out of my own house. We bought this place together. I paid for half of the down payment with my savings. My name is on the mortgage." Harrison let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the sound of the thunder. "Your name?" he sneered, taking a step closer to the edge of the porch while Kendall crossed her arms, watching the spectacle with delight. "Do not make me laugh, Claire. You contribute a pathetic UX researcher's salary. You make peanuts compared to what it takes to maintain a lifestyle in this zip code. You think your little contribution gives you rights here." He leaned in, his eyes narrowing with pure malice. "Let me educate you on how the real world works. 3 months ago, I restructured the ownership. I leveraged this house as collateral against a credit line for my firm. I own the debt, which means I own the equity. You have no standing here. You are a financial ghost in this house, Claire. You brought nothing into this marriage, and you are leaving with nothing." The sheer arrogance in his voice made my blood boil. For 3 years, I had watched him play high-stakes games with other people's money, but I never imagined he would use his corporate maneuvers to strip me of my own home. I looked at Kendall, who let out a soft giggle, adjusting the belt of my robe. "High is right," Claire Kendall added, her tone dripping with condescension. "Harrison needs a real partner, someone who understands high finance and real estate, not a glorified paper pusher who cries every time work gets stressful. You should really just take your bags and leave before you embarrass yourself any further." Something inside me snapped. The years of suppressing my anger, of trying to be the supportive, quiet wife, while Harrison chased his corporate ambitions, evaporated in an instant. I stepped up onto the porch, intending to push past him to grab my purse, my keys, and demand to speak to a lawyer right from the kitchen phone. "I am not going anywhere," I said firmly, my voice shaking with rage as I tried to step around Harrison. "This is my legal residence, and you cannot lock me out without a court order." Harrison did not even bother to block my path with his body. He simply raised his arm, pointed his finger toward the street, and smirked. "Go ahead, try it," he said calmly. Just then, bright red and blue lights illuminated the rain-drenched street. The low rumble of an engine filled the air as 2 police cruisers pulled up along the curb, their emergency lights flashing against the wet trees. I froze on the porch steps, staring at the flashing lights in utter confusion. Harrison took a slow sip of his scotch and smiled, a cold, calculated look that chilled me more than the freezing rain. "I called the precinct 20 minutes ago," Harrison whispered, leaning down so only I could hear him over the storm. "I told them a disgruntled, unstable former employee was trying to break into my private residence and harass my fiancé. If you take one more step toward this door, Claire, I will have them arrest you for hostile trespassing. Let us see how your little tech job handles a mugshot on your record." The heavy boots of the 2 police officers sloshed against the wet pavement as they approached the porch. One officer rested his hand casually on his utility belt, while the other stepped between Harrison and me. They did not look at the garbage bags on the lawn or my soaking wet clothes. They only looked at Harrison, who instantly transformed his demeanor from a mocking predator to a concerned, exhausted homeowner. "Officer, thank you for arriving so quickly," Harrison said smoothly. His voice was practically dripping with manufactured relief. My ex-wife is having a difficult time accepting the separation boundaries. I just need her escorted off the premises so my fiancé and I can have a peaceful evening. I tried to speak, but the cold rain and the sheer shock of his lies made my jaw tremble. I live here, I managed to say, pointing a shaking finger at the front door. My name is on the mortgage. He literally locked me out 20 minutes ago. The older officer turned to me, his expression entirely neutral. Ma, if there is a domestic dispute over property ownership, that is a civil matter for the family courts. Right now, the resident inside has asked you to leave. If you refuse, we will have to detain you for trespassing and disturbing the peace. I looked at the officers, then back at Harrison. Kendall was peeking out from behind his shoulder, holding a manicured hand over her mouth to hide her grin. The police were not going to help me. The law in this exact moment was firmly on the side of the man standing inside the warm, dry house. I swallowed the bitter lump in my throat, nodded silently, and stepped backward off the porch. I walked into the muddy grass and grabbed the torn plastic garbage bags. The officers watched me drag my ruined belongings down the driveway and out of the neighborhood, cul-de-sac. I hauled the heavy soaking bags for 3 blocks until I reached a small, dimly lit bus stop shelter. The plastic awning barely kept the wind out, but it offered a temporary shield from the torrential downpour. I dropped the bags onto the concrete and leaned against the cold glass of the shelter. My teeth chattered violently. I needed to get out of the cold. I needed a hot shower and a bed. And then I would hire the most aggressive divorce attorney in the state first thing in the morning. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. The screen was smeared with rain, but I managed to open my banking app. Harrison and I shared a joint savings account. We had been pooling our money for years, ostensibly for a larger property or an emergency fund. I knew exactly how much was in there. $62,000. I planned to transfer $5,000 to my personal checking account to cover a decent hotel for the week and a retainer for a lawyer. The app loaded. The screen flashed white, then blue, displaying my dashboard. I blinked, wiping the rainwater from my eyes, sure that the screen was glitching due to the storm. Available balance $0. My heart slammed against my ribs. I frantically tapped on the transaction history. The ledger loaded, showing a single massive transfer executed exactly 4 hours ago. Harrison had authorized a wire transfer of the entire $62,000 into a private external account. A wave of pure panic washed over me. I checked my personal checking account. It showed a balance of $14 because my paycheck was directly deposited into our joint account. I had virtually no cash to my name. I felt the air leave my lungs as the brutal reality of state financial law crashed down on me. In our state, any individual named on a joint bank account has the legal right to withdraw the entire balance without the consent or knowledge of the other party. It was a vicious, completely legal maneuver, and Harrison had timed it perfectly. He had wiped out my entire life savings just hours before serving me the divorce papers. My phone buzzed in my freezing hand, startling me. A new text message appeared on the screen. It was an unknown number, but the attached image loaded instantly. It was a photograph of Kendall's hand resting on the steering wheel of Harrison's luxury SUV. On her ring finger sat a massive, ostentatiously large diamond ring. It caught the light, perfectly sparkling, with a price tag that made my stomach churn. Below the image was a text. Harrison's startup money finally bought me the life I deserve. Have a nice night in the rain, sweetie. I stared at the glowing screen. Startup money. Harrison had not used his firm's capital. He had taken my savings, the money I had earned working endless 12-hour shifts, analyzing data to buy his mistress a diamond ring. He had stolen my past to fund her future. I shoved the phone into my pocket, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a response. I dragged my garbage bags to where I had parked my car earlier that morning. My 10-year-old Honda Civic sat under a street lamp, looking battered and incredibly small against the backdrop of the wealthy neighborhood. I shoved the bags into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands shook violently as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered before roaring to life. I turned the heater on full blast, but it only blew lukewarm air. I put the car in drive and headed toward the highway, searching for the cheapest roadside motel I could find. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the flickering neon parking lot of a budget motel. The lobby smelled heavily of bleach and stale cigarette smoke. I stood at the front desk, leaving puddles of rainwater on the linoleum floor, and pulled out my primary credit card. "I need a room for the night," I told the night clerk, pushing my wet hair out of my face. He took the card, ran it through the machine, and frowned. The machine beeped aggressively. "Declined," he said in a bored tone, handing the card back. "That is impossible," I replied, my voice rising in panic. "Try it again, please." He swiped it a second time. The same harsh beep echoed in the quiet lobby. "Declined again." "Ma'am, do you have another card or cash?" I fumbled through my wallet, pulling out my secondary credit card. He swiped it. "Declined." I pulled out a third card, a backup I kept for emergencies. "Declined." I stepped away from the counter, my face burning with humiliation, and dialed the customer service number on the back of the primary card. An automated voice answered cheerfully, informing me that my account had been closed by the primary account holder. Harrison was the primary account holder on all our credit lines. I was only an authorized user. He had called the credit card companies and canceled every single one of my supplementary cards. He had meticulously cut off every avenue of financial survival, trapping me in an invisible cage of poverty. I walked out of the motel lobby, the harsh neon lights reflecting in the puddles around my worn-out shoes. I got back into my Civic and sat behind the steering wheel. I had $14 to my name. I had no access to credit. I had no savings. I reached into the back seat, pulling a damp sweater from one of the ripped garbage bags, and wrapped it around my shivering shoulders. I reclined the driver's seat, as far back as it would go. The rain continued to hammer against the windshield, sounding like a steady drumbeat of defeat. I curled into a tight ball in the freezing cabin of my 10-year-old sedan. The cold seeped into my bones, but the physical chill was nothing compared to the absolute, terrifying realization that the man I had loved for years had meticulously engineered my total destruction. I woke up the next morning to the harsh glare of the early sun piercing through the rain-streaked windshield of my Honda Civic. Every muscle in my body locked in a stiff, unnatural position from sleeping curled around the steering wheel. The air inside the cabin was freezing thick with the damp condensation of my own breath. I sat up slowly, my head pounding with a dull, relentless ache that radiated down my neck. I had survived the night, but survival was not going to pay for a lawyer, a hot meal, or a hotel room. I needed to go to work. I needed to log into the corporate server, keep my job, and figure out a strategic plan to fight back. But my primary work laptop was currently sitting in a garbage bag on the front lawn of the house I used to own, ruined by the storm. Then I remembered a small sliver of luck. Last Sunday, I had visited Harrison's younger sister, Stella, to help her set up a new smart home security system. I had brought my backup work laptop with me and absent-mindedly left it on her kitchen island. It was my only lifeline to my job, my only remaining connection to a stable paycheck. I forced my numb fingers to turn the ignition key. The engine coughed twice before sputtering to life, the heater still blowing useless lukewarm air. I pulled out of the dingy motel parking lot and navigated the heavy morning traffic toward the affluent gated community where Stella lived. At 30 years old, Stella had always mirrored her brother's profound arrogance. She lived in a sprawling modern farmhouse, funded entirely by her husband, Jamal. Jamal was a 32-year-old independent auditor, a brilliant and quiet African-American man who always seemed entirely out of place among Harrison's loud, boastful, and incredibly toxic family. Jamal was the only one who ever treated me with genuine respect, often offering a sympathetic smile when Stella made her cutting remarks at holiday dinners. I parked my battered sedan at the end of Stella's pristine paverstone driveway. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My hair was damp and tangled, my eyes bloodshot, and my clothes deeply wrinkled from sleeping in them. I looked exactly like the broken woman Harrison wanted me to be. I took a deep breath, gathered whatever shred of dignity I had left, and walked up to the heavy mahogany front door. I rang the doorbell twice, waiting in the crisp morning air. The door swung open. Stella stood there in expensive designer yoga pants, holding a steaming mug of artisan coffee. She did not look surprised to see my disheveled, freezing state. In fact, a cruel, knowing smile spread across her perfectly made-up face. Harrison had clearly already called her to gloat about the lockout. "I am just here for my backup laptop," I said, keeping my voice as steady as possible, refusing to let her see me shiver. "I left it on your kitchen counter last week. I need it for work. Please just hand it to me and I will leave your property." Stella took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee, leaning her shoulder against the doorframe to physically block the entrance. Her eyes ran over my rumpled clothes and muddy shoes with absolute disgust. "You really have no shame, Claire," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom, "showing up here looking like a homeless person. Harrison told me you caused a massive scene last night in front of the neighbors. Honestly, you should be entirely embarrassed by your behavior." I stared at her, my hands balling into tight fists at my sides. "He locked me out of my own house and stole my entire life savings. Stella, he committed financial abuse." "Oh, please." Stella laughed, a harsh grating sound that echoed in the quiet suburban street. "He took back what rightfully belonged to him. You were just a placeholder, Claire. A boring, low-earning placeholder. Harrison is building an empire. He needs a woman who matches his ambition, not a pathetic researcher who cannot even give him children." The comment about my infertility felt like a physical strike to the chest, stealing the air from my lungs. Stella knew exactly how many grueling, painful medical treatments I had endured trying to build a family with her brother. She knew how thoroughly the clinical failures had broken my heart. Yet, she wielded that trauma like a weapon. "Kendall is a powerhouse." Stella continued, clearly relishing the pain flashing across my face. "She just closed a $5 million commercial real estate deal yesterday." $5 million, Claire. That is what a real partner looks like. She is a winner. You are just dead weight holding my brother back." My vision blurred with a volatile mix of exhaustion and absolute fury. "Dead weight." I repeated, my voice rising above a whisper. "I spent my entire 20s carrying this family when your mother got sick with early onset dementia. Where were you? You were backpacking through Europe on Harrison's dime." "Where was Harrison?" "He was working late to build his so-called empire. I was the one changing her clothes. I was the one managing her complex medications, taking her to every single doctor's appointment and holding her hand while she forgot her own name. I sacrificed my youth, my career growth, and my peace of mind to care for your mother, while you all looked the other way." Stella rolled her eyes, completely unmoved by the undeniable truth. "That was your basic duty as a wife," she scoffed. "You lived under our family's roof. You ate our food. You enjoyed the luxurious lifestyle my brother provided. Caring for our mother was the bare minimum you could do to pay your rent. Harrison owes you absolutely nothing for that. In fact, you owe him for putting up with your mediocrity for this long." I stood frozen on the pristine welcome mat. The sheer rewrite of history, the utter lack of humanity in her words, left me entirely speechless. They had eagerly consumed my time, my savings, and my youth. And now they were brazenly rewriting the narrative to make me the villain. There was no point in arguing with someone who viewed basic human compassion as a financial transaction. "Just give me my laptop," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, flat tone. "I am not leaving this porch without it." "You can buy a new one with your non-existent savings," Stella spat. "Have a terrible life, Claire." She grabbed the heavy brass handle and moved to violently slam the mahogany door right in my face. But before the heavy wood could click into the frame, a large, strong hand reached out from the shadows of the foyer and caught the edge of the door, stopping it dead with a loud thud. Stella gasped and stepped back in shock. Jamal stepped into the doorway, moving completely in front of his wife. He was already dressed in a sharp gray suit for his accounting firm, but his tie was loosened and his face was unusually pale. Jamal looked down at me, and I immediately saw it in his eyes. He was not looking at me with the usual quiet pity he displayed at family dinners. He was looking at me with intense, unspoken anxiety. Jamal stepped firmly past his wife, ignoring her loud gasp of indignation. "What on earth are you doing?" Stella shrieked, reaching out to grab the sleeve of his tailored suit jacket. Jamal did not even look at her. He kept his eyes locked on mine, his expression a tight mask of absolute urgency. In his left hand he held my black nylon laptop bag. He extended it toward me, I reached out with trembling fingers to take the handle. As my skin brushed against his, I felt something else. Jamal flipped his wrist slightly, pressing a tightly wadded, crumpled piece of paper directly into the center of my palm. He squeezed my hand shut around it, a silent but desperate command to keep it hidden from his wife. Stella grabbed his shoulder, her sharp manicured nails digging into the expensive fabric of his suit. "Get away from her, Jamal," she yelled, her face twisting with ugly rage. I told her to get off our property. Jamal allowed his wife to pull him backward, but as he retreated into the foyer, he leaned forward just an inch. "He did not just take the house," Jamal whispered rapidly, his deep voice barely carrying over the sound of the morning wind. "Look at the corporate filings from last month." Before I could even process his words or ask a single question, Stella aggressively yanked him back inside. She grabbed the heavy brass handle and slammed the mahogany door shut with a deafening crack. The deadbolt slid into place with a sharp, heavy click, locking me out once again. I stood frozen on the porch for a long moment, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I looked down at my closed fist. My knuckles were entirely white. Whatever Jamal had just given me, it was dangerous enough that he had to sneak it past his own wife. I turned around and sprinted down the paver-stone driveway, desperate to get back to the isolated safety of my car. I threw the heavy laptop bag onto the passenger seat of my 10-year-old Honda Civic and slammed the driver's side door shut. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely peel my fingers open. I placed the crumpled ball of paper on the steering wheel and began to carefully smooth out the deep creases. The paper was slightly damp from my sweaty palm, but the black ink was perfectly legible. It was a printed spreadsheet, heavily cropped, and clearly printed in a rush from a secure accounting database. At the very top, the header read Commercial Debt Obligation and Collateral Summary. I scanned the columns, my eyes darting across the rows of complex financial jargon until they locked onto a specific string of numbers. It was the exact address of the suburban home I had bought with Harrison. I traced my finger across the row. The document outlined a massive high-interest business loan issued exactly 30 days ago. The borrower was Harrison's venture capital firm. The collateral securing the debt was my primary residence, and the total loan amount was a staggering $2 million. The air vanished from the small cabin of my car. A cold, suffocating panic gripped my chest. $2 million. Harrison had not just restructured the ownership of our home to kick me out. He had secretly leveraged the entire property to secure an enormous injection of cash for his failing startup, but that was legally impossible. My name was still on the original deed and the mortgage. No legitimate bank would ever approve a collateral lien of that magnitude without the explicit notarized signature of both homeowners unless he forged it. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The smug look on Harrison's face the night before suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. He had drained our joint savings to fund his immediate lifestyle. But the real money, the millions he needed to keep his arrogant facade alive, was tied directly to this fraudulent loan. If his venture capital firm defaulted on those payments, the bank would immediately seize the house. He had literally gambled my only asset on his own reckless ego. Jamal was an auditor. He had access to the raw financial data of Harrison's firm, and he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy my ex-husband. If I could get to the local bank branch and contest the lien, if I could prove to the loan officers that I never signed the collateral agreement, the bank would instantly freeze Harrison's accounts, pending a federal fraud investigation. I shoved the crumpled paper deep into the front pocket of my damp jeans. I grabbed my car keys, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The crushing despair from the night before evaporated, replaced by a razor-sharp, blinding fury. I thrust the key into the ignition and twisted it hard. The engine roared to life. I reached for the gear shift to throw the car into drive. Suddenly, a massive, violent jolt rocked the entire vehicle. The impact was so severe, my head snapped backward, hitting the headrest. A loud metallic crunch echoed through the quiet suburban street, followed by the high-pitched whine of industrial hydraulics. I gasped, my hands flying up to brace myself against the steering wheel. I looked in the rear-view mirror, my eyes widening in pure horror. A massive yellow tow truck had silently backed down the cul-de-sac and positioned itself directly behind my Civic. The driver, a burly man in a neon safety vest, was standing at the rear of my vehicle, operating a control panel. Thick metal arms had already clamped tightly around my rear tires, hoisting the back of my car 2 feet into the air. "Hey!" I screamed, throwing the car door open and stumbling out into the street. "What are you doing?" "Put my car down. You cannot tow this. I am parked legally." The driver did not even flinch. He casually pulled a thick clipboard from his heavy jacket and walked toward me, his expression completely bored. "Are you Claire?" he asked, glancing down at a sheet of paper. "Yes," I yelled, waving my arms frantically. "Put the car down right now. I have to go to the bank." "This is a massive mistake." "No mistake, lady," the driver said flatly, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "This is a court-ordered repossession. Your lender issued the recovery order yesterday afternoon. The account is completely delinquent." "Delinquent?" I repeated, shaking my head in total confusion. "That is impossible. The payments on this car are automatically deducted from my checking account every single month." "I have never missed a payment in my life," the driver sighed, flipping to the second page of his documents. "I do not know what to tell you. The primary co-signer on the auto loan contacted the lender 3 months ago, canceled the automatic payments, and explicitly refused to cover the balance. The account is 90 days past due." The lender called the entire note. "The car belongs to the bank now." My vision swam as the brutal reality of the trap closed around me. The primary co-signer, Harrison. He had co-signed the auto loan 5 years ago, when my credit was too new to get a decent interest rate. He had deliberately logged into the portal, canceled the auto draft, and let the account default all while I blissfully assumed the payments were clearing. He had orchestrated this months in advance. He wanted me completely immobilized. He wanted me trapped peniles and entirely dependent on his non-existent mercy. "Please," I begged, the anger draining out of me, replaced by a desperate, humiliating panic. "You cannot take my car. Everything I have left in the world is in the trunk. My clothes, my father's picture, everything. Just give me 24 hours. The driver shook his head, completely unmoved by my desperation. "Take your personal belongings out of the cabin, lady. You have exactly 60 seconds before I drive away with this vehicle. If you interfere, I am legally required to call the police. And given what I just heard, I do not think you want the cops showing up again." I stared at him, completely defeated. I turned round and reached into the passenger seat, grabbing my laptop bag. That was all I could carry. The trunk was locked, and the hydraulic lift angle made it impossible to open safely. My clothes, my shoes, the last remaining memories of my childhood, were entirely trapped inside a vehicle I no longer owned. I stood on the cold pavement, clutching the laptop bag to my chest, and watched in utter silence as the tow truck pulled away. The flashing Yeso lights disappeared around the corner of the affluent neighborhood, taking away my last shred of independence. I was entirely alone, standing on the side of a road 3 miles away from the commercial district, with $0 to my name and a forged $2 million loan statement burning a hole in my pocket. I took my first step forward away from the empty curb, the cold rain instantly soaking through the thin canvas of my ruined sneakers. I had 3 miles of winding suburban roads between me and the nearest commercial bank branch. I gripped my laptop bag tightly against my chest to shield it from the relentless downpour. Every step sent a sharp jolt of pain up my calves, my feet slipping inside waterlogged shoes. Expensive luxury cars sped past me on the slick asphalt, their heavy tires spraying freezing sheets of muddy water against my bare legs. Not a single driver slowed down in this wealthy zip code. A woman walking in the rain without an umbrella was not considered a neighbor in distress. She was simply an eyes sore. I kept my head down, forcing my frozen legs to keep moving forward. The physical agony was intense, but the burning rage in my chest kept me entirely warm. I touched the outside of my damp pocket, feeling the outline of the crumpled corporate loan statement Jamal had secretly given me. Harrison thought he had completely immobilized me. He thought destroying my credit, stealing my savings, and taking my car would force me to crawl back to him and beg for his mercy. He vastly underestimated my endurance. I walked for over an hour, my breathing turning into heavy gasps, By the time the sprawling glass and steel facade of the commercial bank finally came into view, I pushed through the heavy revolving doors, immediately bringing a thick trail of muddy water onto the pristine marble floor of the lobby. The aggressive air conditioning blasted against my soaked clothes, making my teeth chatter violently. The bank was mostly empty at this hour, save for a few wealthy clients sipping complimentary espresso on plush leather couches. They all turned to stare at me with undisguised disgust. I ignored them completely. I marched straight past the velvet security ropes and approached the desk of a junior teller. She was a young woman with a perfectly structured blowout and a highly condescending smile, typing leisurely on a mechanical keyboard. I did not wait for her to greet me. I dropped my heavy laptop bag onto the floor, reached into my pocket, and slapped the damp, crumpled commercial loan statement directly onto her immaculate glass counter. I need to pull the complete transaction history on this property immediately, I demanded, my voice, but entirely steady. My name is Claire, and I am the primary co-owner of the residential collateral listed on that sheet. The signature authorizing this $2 million loan is a complete forgery. I need you to freeze the dispersal accounts and escalate this to your fraud department right now. The junior teller blinked clearly, taken aback by my authoritative tone. She leaned back in her plush ergonomic chair, her eyes scanning my dripping hair, my wrinkled clothes, and the growing puddle of dirty rainwater forming around my ruined shoes. Her condescending smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer unprofessional disdain. She used a single manicured fingernail to slide the damp paper closer to her keyboard. "Ma'am," she said, dragging out the word with deliberate slowness, "you cannot just walk in here off the street and demand we freeze corporate accounts. Let me see your identification." I pulled my damp driver license from my wallet and handed it to her. She snatched it from my fingers, typed my information into her terminal, and stared at the glowing monitor. A moment later, she let out a sharp, mocking sigh. "Well, Claire," she said, emphasizing my first name with deep disrespect, "I cannot pull any transaction history for you, because you do not have authorization on this specific corporate account, and frankly, looking at your personal financial profile, I am amazed you even have the nerve to walk into this branch today." "What are you talking about?" I snapped, gripping the edge of the glass counter to steady my shaking hands. "My name is on the original deed to that house. Your name is also on 7 heavily defaulted credit lines." She shot back, turning her monitor slightly, so I could see the glaring red alerts covering my profile. "Your credit score is practically non-existent. It is currently sitting at an abysmal 410. You have maxed out credit cards, multiple shadow accounts in severe delinquency, and a vehicle repossession order that officially executed this morning. You are a massive financial liability. We would not even approve you for a $50 overdraft, let alone grant you access to a multi-million-dollar corporate ledger." I stared at the screen, my heart dropping entirely into my stomach. Harrison had not just canned my supplementary cards. Over the last 2 years, he had secretly opened multiple shadow credit cards using my social security number. He had maxed them out to silently fund his lavish lifestyle and deliberately let them default, utterly destroying my financial identity without my knowledge. He had built a flawless, invisible cage around me. "You do not understand," I pleaded, desperation finally creeping into my voice. "Those accounts are entirely fraudulent. My ex-husband opened them without my consent. You have to look at the collateral agreement on that commercial loan. He forged my signature to leverage my house. If you do not flag this right now, he is going to embezzle those funds." The teller rolled her eyes completely, losing her patience with me. She grabbed my damp driver license and tossed it carelessly back across the counter. It slid off the slit glass and landed on the wet floor. "I understand perfectly," she sneered, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of the bank manager standing across the lobby. "You are a delinquent debtor trying to blame your ex-husband for your own terrible financial choices. I am not going to entertain this ridiculous conspiracy theory, and I am certainly not going to let you drip mud all over my station any longer." She reached out and firmly pressed a red button on her desk phone. "Security, we need assistance at Station 4, she announced over the intercom. We have a loitering vagrant who is refusing to leave the premises. Please escort her out immediately. I stood frozen, the heavy weight of absolute defeat crashing down on me. I had nothing left. No money, no car, no home, and now no identity. Two large security guards in dark suits began walking briskly toward me from the front entrance. I bent down to pick up my driver license from the dirty floor. As my fingers brushed against my leather wallet, they grazed a small, hidden zipper compartment tucked deep inside the billfold. My breath caught in my throat. I stopped moving entirely. 5 years ago, just days before he passed away from a sudden heart attack, my father Thomas had handed me a small sealed envelope. He told me to put it in my wallet and never open it unless I had absolutely nowhere else to turn. I had completely forgotten it existed until this exact moment. The security guards were 10 feet away. "Mom, you need to step away from the counter and come with us," the taller guard ordered, reaching out to grab my arm. I ignored him. My fingers dug into the hidden zipper. I ripped it open and pulled out the contents. It was not a piece of paper or a check. It was a solid, heavy matte black metal card. It had no bank logo, no phone number, and no visible account details. The only marking was a faint, deeply embossed silver insignia in the center, and a thick magnetic strip on the back. I stood up straight, brushing the guard's hand away with a sudden, icy confidence. I looked the junior teller dead in the eye and slammed the heavy black metal card onto the glass counter. The thick metal hit the glass with a loud, authoritative crack that echoed across the entire silent bank floor. "Run the card," I commanded. The junior teller stared at the heavy piece of metal resting on her pristine glass counter. She blinked slowly, entirely, unfazed by my sudden burst of authority. Instead of picking it up to swipe it through her terminal, she let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. She picked up the black card using only her thumb and index finger, holding it up to the fluorescent lights, as if it were a dirty, disease-ridden napkin. "What exactly is this supposed to be?" she asked, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. There is no microchip. There is no bank logo. The magnetic strip on the back is completely worn down. Are you trying to hand me a novelty gift card, Claire? Do you really think a fake piece of metal is going to suddenly wipe away your massive debt and fix your pathetic credit score? The two security guards had now reached my side. The taller one clamped his heavy hand down on my left shoulder, his grip tightening painfully through my soaked coat. "That is enough of a scene for today, Ma," and the guard said gruffly, "You are coming with us right now. We can do this the easy way, or we can call the local police to handle your trespassing charge." I tried to jerk my shoulder away, but his grip was like a vice. I kept my eyes locked on the teller, refusing to let her see my fear. I said, "Run the card," I repeated, my voice rising in volume, echoing across the quiet marble-lined lobby. The teller rolled her eyes, dropping all pretense of professional courtesy. "I am not running a fake piece of metal through my secure terminal just to humor a delusional debtor," she snapped. "In fact, since you are attempting to present fraudulent financial instruments to a federally insured institution, it is banking policy to confiscate and destroy the counterfeit item." She opened the top drawer of her desk and pulled out a long, heavy pair of stainless steel scissors. She positioned the blades directly over the center of the black metal card, preparing to cut it straight in half. I panicked, lunging forward to grab it, but the security guard yanked me back so hard. My ribs slammed into his forearm. My father had given me that card on his deathbed. It was the only thing I had left of him, the last physical connection to the man who had raised me. "Wait," I yelled, struggling against the heavy guard. "Do not touch that. Give it back to me." The teller ignored me completely, aligning the sharp metal blades over the faint silver insignia, applying intense pressure to snap the metal. At that exact moment, the heavy wooden doors of the executive offices swung open. Mr. Mitchell, the 50-year-old stoic branch manager, stepped out onto the lobby floor. He was a man who exuded quiet absolute power, dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit, holding a leather-bound tablet. I was deep in conversation with a wealthy local real estate developer, guiding him toward the main exit. As Mitchell walked past the teller station, the overhead fluorescent lights caught the metallic surface of the black card just as the teller prepared to destroy it. The faint, deeply embossed silver insignia flashed brightly in the light. Mitchell stopped dead in his tracks. He did not just pause. His entire body physically froze, as if someone had injected ice water directly into his veins. The expensive leather-bound tablet slipped from his fingers, hitting the marble floor with a loud, echoing smack. The wealthy developer beside him frowned, asking if he was all right. But Mitchell did not even hear him. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly ash color. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. "What on earth are you doing?" Mitchell roared his deep voice, shattering the quiet atmosphere of the entire bank. He lunged forward with a speed that entirely defied his age. He reached across the glass counter and violently slapped the stainless steel scissors right out of the junior teller's hand. The heavy scissors flew through the air and crashed against the back wall, narrowly missing an expensive glass partition. The teller shrieked, jumping back in her ergonomic chair. "Mr. Mitchell?" she stammered, her face flushed with extreme shock and confusion. "I was just confiscating a fake card from this vagrant. She is severely delinquent, and she is causing a massive disturbance on the floor." Mitchell did not even look at her. He leaned over the counter, staring at the black metal card as if it were a live explosive. He carefully picked it up by the edges, his hands shaking so violently, the metal rattled against the glass surface. He brought it inches from his face, tracing the faint silver insignia with a trembling thumb. He spun around to face the teller, his eyes blazing with a fury so intense it made the young woman shrink back into her chair. "Mom, quickly, look at this," Mitchell shouted, his voice cracking with absolute panic as he shoved the card toward her face. "Do you have any idea what you just tried to destroy? Do you have any concept of whose insignia this is?" The teller shook her head, tears of humiliation welling up in her eyes. "I just assumed it was a novelty card, sir. Her credit score is in the 400s. Mitchell slammed his fist against the desk, silencing her instantly. "You are fired," he stated, his voice dropping to a deadly absolute whisper. "Pack up your personal belongings immediately. You are permanently terminated from this institution, and I will personally ensure you never work in the financial sector again. Now get out of my sight." The teller burst into loud sobs, grabbing her purse and sprinting away from the desk in pure shame. The two security guards instantly let go of my arms, taking several nervous steps backward. The entire bank floor had fallen completely silent. The wealthy clients on the plush leather couches stopped drinking their espresso, staring at the scene in absolute shock. Mitchell took a deep, shuddering breath, trying desperately to regain his professional composure. He turned to me. The absolute power and authority he had just displayed vanished instantly, replaced by a posture of deep, undeniable reverence. He adjusted his suit jacket, stepped around the glass counter, and bowed his head slightly toward me. "Emma, I sincerely apologize for the inexcusable behavior of my former staff," Mitchell said, his voice trembling with deep respect. "We had no idea you were coming today. Please forgive this catastrophic breach of protocol." I stood there still dripping wet from the rain, my ruined shoes pooling muddy water on the expensive marble floor. I was utterly bewildered. 5 minutes ago, I was a loitering vagrant about to be thrown into the freezing street. Now the most powerful man in the building was bowing to me. "Do you know what this card is?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mitchell nodded slowly, holding the heavy black metal with the utmost care. "I do, Ma. I have worked in upper-tier banking for 30 years, and I have only ever seen one of these in person. It is a master ledger key. The security protocols for this account supersede every single rule in this branch." He gestured toward the back of the lobby with an open, inviting hand. "Please come with me," he urged softly. "We cannot discuss this on the public floor." He did not ask for my identification. He did not ask for my signature or mention my ruined credit score. He completely bypassed every security protocol, leading me past the velvet ropes and the staring clients. We walked down a long, quiet corridor lined with expensive artwork until we reached a set of heavy steel elevator doors. Mitchell pulled a physical key from his pocket, inserted it into a hidden panel on the wall, and turned it. The door slid open, revealing a private elevator car lined with dark mahogany and brushed steel. I stepped inside, clutching my damp laptop bag tightly to my chest. Mitchell followed me, pressing a single button, marked with a negative symbol. We were not going to the executive suite on the upper floors. We were descending deep underground, heading straight down into the subterranean VIP vault. The elevator descended in absolute silence, the gentle hum of the mechanics, the only sound in the small mahogany cabin. When the doors finally slid open, I stepped out into a sprawling subterranean room, made entirely of polished concrete and reinforced glass. There were no teller windows here, only a massive central console surrounded by heavy steel monitors. Mitchell walked briskly to the console and gestured for me to sit in a plush leather chair. He took the black metal card from his pocket with extreme care and slid it into a specialized biometric scanner. The heavy steel monitors instantly flashed a brilliant emerald green. A complex web of financial data flooded the screens, scrolling faster than my eyes could follow. Mitchell turned to me, his posture stiff and formal, addressing me with absolute reverence. "Welcome back, Miss Claire," he said softly. "The trust has been awaiting your arrival for 5 years." I shook my head in utter confusion, shivering slightly in my damp clothes. "Trust," I repeated. My father was a quiet middle-class hardware supplier. He ran a small shop in Fairfield. He did not have a trust. Mitchell offered a gentle, knowing smile. Thomas was a brilliant man who valued his privacy above all else. The hardware store was merely a quiet hobby, a front to keep his family shielded from the vicious nature of his true work. Your father was the silent architect of one of the most ruthless corporate debt acquisition firms on the East Coast. He engineered hostile takeovers, bought distressed assets, and liquidated failing companies. He hid his true wealth behind a meticulously structured blind trust to protect you from the dangerous people he dealt with. Mitchell tapped the glass screen, bringing up a centralized dashboard. The numbers on the screen were so large they looked completely unreal. The trust contains over $80 million in liquid assets, along with a massive portfolio of commercial real estate, Mitchell explained, pointing to the glowing figures. Because it is an irrevocable blind trust established long before your marriage, every single penny is legally shielded from any marital property claims. Your husband has zero claim to this money. I sat absolutely frozen in the plush leather chair. $80 million. Hours ago, I had only $14 to my name and was forced to sleep in my freezing car. Now, I easily possessed more than enough liquid capital to buy Harrison's entire firm 10 times over. But the shock of the inheritance was nothing compared to what Mitchell showed me next. He pulled up a specific subsidiary ledger, his expression turning grim. "Miss Claire, I need you to look at this," he said, enlarging a document on the central monitor. I traced the digital ledger with my index finger, completely unable to breathe. One of the subsidiary, corporate lenders owned entirely by my father's secretive trust was the exact same firm that had quietly issued Harrison's fraudulent $2 million business loan against my residential property. I stared at the glowing green text on the monitor, the reality of the situation slowly washing over me. Harrison had not outsmarted me. He had unwittingly walked straight into a trap my father had built years ago. I did not just have the money to fight him. I literally owned the debt that was keeping his entire venture capital firm afloat. If I called in that loan, his entire fabricated world would collapse overnight before I could fully process the immense power I now held. Mitchell picked up a secure phone on the console and pressed a single button. "We need counsel in the vault immediately," he said quietly. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy steel elevator doors slid open again. A woman walked in carrying a sleek leather briefcase. She was tall in her mid-40s with sharp features and an impeccably tailored suit that screamed absolute authority. Mitchell introduced her as Veronica, a razor-sharp corporate financial lawyer, retained exclusively by the trust. I reached into my damp pocket, pulled out the crumpled commercial loan statement Jamal had secretly handed me on the porch, and placed it on the concrete table. Veronica did not ask any pointless questions about my ruined clothes or my muddy shoes. She simply opened her briefcase, pulled out a high-resolution scanner, and digitized the wrinkled paper. The document instantly appeared on the massive central monitor. Veronica typed a rapid sequence of commands, bypassing multiple banking firewalls to access the original digital loan application Harrison had submitted 30 days ago. She isolated the final page of the contract and zoomed in heavily on the collateral agreement. The screen displayed a high-definition scan of a notarized deed transfer. At the very bottom, next to Harrison's bold handwriting, was my own signature, or at least an incredibly desperate attempt at it. Veronica leaned closer to the screen, her eyes scanning the digital ink with predatory focus. "This is a complete fabrication," Veronica stated, her voice as cold as ice. "The pressure points on the pen strokes do not match your historical banking signatures. Harrison forged your name on this document and transmitted it across state lines to secure these funds. He has committed federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and severe bank fraud." Veronica turned to face me, closing her laptop with a sharp snap. "We can contact the federal authorities right now, Claire. With this undeniable evidence, agents will raid his office by noon, and he will be sitting in a federal holding cell by dinner." The option was deeply tempting. The thought of seeing Harrison in handcuffs today sent a thrill through my chest. But as I thought about him and Kendall laughing at me in the freezing rain, a darker realization took root in my mind.